Welcome to CFN Media. I'm John Veneri, editor of Catholic Family News. On March 7, 2015, Pope Francis celebrated the 50th anniversary of the All-Vernacular Liturgy, and he used the event as an occasion to let it be known that as far as he is concerned, any return of the Church to the Latin Tridentine Mass is out of the question. He called such an idea a step backwards. Okay, so here's what's happening. 50 years ago, March 7th, 1965, Paul VI celebrated the first all-vernacular liturgy at the Church of the Ognissanti, the Church of All Saints, and of course it was in Rome, so it was celebrated all in Italian instead of Latin. Now, part of the symbolism going on here was that Paul VI did not celebrate this first all-vernacular liturgy in one of the great patriarchal basilicas of Rome. No, rather he celebrated it at a regular parish church, okay, a church of the people, to inaugurate the all-vernacular liturgy. And this liturgy would be celebrated, of course, in the language of the people. And we're at the beginning of the Vatican II liturgical changes, so he celebrated the Mass not facing our Lord in the tabernacle, but facing the people. Okay, now Pope Francis loves this exaltation of the people, so of course he's going to celebrate this as he celebrates all things regarding the council. So Pope Francis in his March 7th homily would say that it was here that Paul VI effectively, I'm using his words now, inaugurated the liturgical reform of Vatican II. And he did it with the celebration of this Mass, and he did it with the Mass, as he says, in the language of the people. Now, this liturgical reform, liturgical revolution really, and I think you know this, it would go on to give us the Novus Ordo Mass that was released in 1969. The same Novus Ordo Mass that Cardinal Ottaviani and Bacci critiqued in the critical study, and they said in their letter of to Paul VI on June 5th, 1969, they said that the new Mass, I'm quoting now, represents both in its whole and in its details a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated by Session 22 of the Council of Trent. So in any event, Francis always squarely behind the Vatican II revolution. He celebrated this 50th anniversary of the all-vernacular liturgy, and also he used it as an occasion to celebrate the entire post-conciliar revolution. And one of the most striking parts of his homily on this occasion is when he said, I'll quote now, quote, "Let us thank the Lord for what he has done in his church in these 50 years of liturgical reform. It was truly a courageous gesture for the church to draw near to the people of God so that they are able to understand well what they are doing." Okay, now there's a sticky little side point here, and that is that the liturgical reform, anyone who knows anything about what happened back then, the liturgical reform, this new all-vernacular liturgy and this Novus Ordo, it immediately caused a mass and lasting defection of Catholics from the Church worldwide. A lot we could talk about this, but I want to continue with the quote. Francis says, "This is important for us to follow the Mass in this way. It is not possible to go backwards. We must always go forward. Always forward. And those who go backward are mistaken." Close quote. So he's talking to traditional Catholics, of course, telling us that we are mistaken. But what's interesting is, do you see what's going on here? Pope Francis is actually saying that there is something in the church that can't be changed. It's kind of funny, really. And you'll notice, too, that the only time progressivists talk like this, or usually the only time that progressivists talk like this, is when they want to solidify the revolution. Pope John Paul II did the same thing regarding the new ecumenical orientation. He said there's no going back. It can't be changed. He said this in his encyclical Ut Unum Sint, 1995, and we read there, John Paul says, quote, "At the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church committed herself irrevocably to following the path of the ecumenical venture. Now, John Paul II, one of the most revolutionary popes in history, his entire pontificate is one of change, 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 new things, new things, new things. But here he is saying that there is something in the church, this precious ecumenism, that can't be changed. All right, it's kind of funny. Now, there's a lot to say about Vatican II's liturgical revolution and the new Mass, but I want to limit myself to a principal aspect of the all vernacular liturgy, and that is the fact that it represents defiance of the Church's consistent centuries-old magisterium, wherein an all vernacular liturgy was condemned. There was an outstanding Thomistic theologian, and his name was Father Edward Hanaho. He wrote in the 1950s and in the 60s, and he was wise to what was going on at the time. And he pointed out that it's a tactic of ecumenists, and by extension of modernists, to pretend the magisterium has not spoken in certain areas that get in the way with the new program. They don't necessarily deny it, they just don't talk about it. They pretend it doesn't exist. And here is what we have happening here. We have this all vernacular liturgy foisted on us by ecumenists in high place, a real top-down operation. And these men simply pretend that the magisterium has not spoken regarding the all vernacular liturgy, the fact that it is condemned and it shouldn't be done. And then they celebrate this flagrant disobedience as if it was a step, it is genuine progress in the church. Now I'm going to give four of the most obvious examples of what I'm talking about regarding church teaching and the vernacular. The Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, the dogmatic Council of Trent, forbids an all vernacular liturgy. You read it in Canon 9, Session 22 of the Council of Trent, and it teaches infallibly, quote, oh, one thing you should know about this too, there's a number of other things in this Canon 9, but I've just extracted the vernacular liturgy part that we're talking about. So Canon 9 says, quote, if anyone says that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vernacular tongue only, let him be anathema, close quote. That's pretty clear. I don't see how else that can be read. Then we have, of course, Pope Pius VI's letter, Auctorem Fidei, of 1794, and here Pius VI specifically denounces the demand, here's his terminology, of expressing the liturgy in the vernacular language. And he denounced this idea as, I'm quoting now, quote, rash, offensive to pious ears, insulting to the church, favorable to the charge of heretics against it. We move on to Pius XI. Pius XI, in his 1922 apostolic letter Officiorum Omnium, and he says, quote, knowledge and use of this Latin language, so intimately bound up with the church's life, is important not so much on cultural or literary grounds, but for religious reasons. And here's a very important quote. Pius goes on to say, quote, for the church, precisely because it embraces all nations and is destined to endure unto the end of time, of its very nature requires a language which is universal, immutable, and non-vernacular, close quote. And finally, of course, there is Pope Pius XII's 1947 encyclical on the sacred liturgy, and here's what he said. It's a famous quote, quote, the use of the Latin language prevailing in a great part of the church affords at once an imposing sign of unity and an effective safeguard against corruption, close quote. So what we see, the modern all vernacular liturgy stands condemned by these Council of Trent, these papal exhortations, and also we see Pius XII's warning, his predictions come to pass. We see with this all vernacular liturgy and the new liturgy, we see the breakdown of unity that he talked about and the corruption of liturgy, primarily through the introduction of the Novus Ordo Mass, which was a Mass that was written to satisfy demands of ecumenism. And we also see the countless liturgical abuses that flow from this new liturgy. So Francis says that we must not go backwards. But really, the all-vernacular liturgy is not a step in a forward direction. It is not a step in a backwards direction. It is a step in the wrong direction. Dead wrong. It is a defiance of the perennial teaching and practice of the Latin Church throughout the centuries. It is nothing to celebrate. And the enforcement of this all-vernacular liturgy and the claim that anyone who wishes to go back to the true Latin liturgy is mistaken, with respect, this is simply an abuse of authority, and it is a corruption of authority. Because, and again, I say this with respect, dear Papa Bergoglio, if you tell us that we should disobey in this matter, that we should disobey the consistent voice of Peter throughout the centuries, then why should we listen to your voice now? Why should we listen to anything you say? By fostering the post-conciliar revolution, you undercut your own authority and you subvert the Church in the process. So as I said, there's a lot more to talk about on this topic. And on our next broadcast, I'm going to spotlight some of the fundamental problems with the Novus Ordo Mass. So please stay tuned. Sign up to our CFN Media, our YouTube videos, so you don't miss anything. And we'll see you on the next program, which I hope I'll be able to produce relatively soon. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.